So I'll make this one very, very brief. All I wanted to do is say that for the early U.S. stuff, what we're looking for is why the U.S. Constitution was written in the first place and why enough of the states ratified it. And a related question, I suppose, that might be of interest is why did Rhode Island initially reject it before later ratifying it? Because answering that question kind of forces us to think about what was wrong with the Constitution from the perspective of the people who had just fought the American Revolution. So you can answer all these questions with the textbook, and that's basically what I want you to do. But if you look at the form of government that was established during the American Revolution, the Articles of Confederation, which Rhode Island Stephen Hopkins had a lot to do with writing. The big problem with the Articles of Confederation, of course, is that it doesn't really provide enough power, enough authority for any kind of national government. And so the Continental Congress, the National Congress, is unable to raise any money to pay for the war, and the various state governments, the colonial governments really, don't work together. And nobody really is willing to pay for the common defense. Nobody is willing to pay taxes for a national government. They just want to pay their own local taxes. And this doesn't really work to establish a strong nation. It's fine for these independent colonies, but if they're going to establish a United States, they need to have a stronger national government. And there are a number of crises that your textbook, of course, goes into, including Shays' Rebellion after the Revolutionary War, this uprising of Western farmers in Western Massachusetts. And these things, along with the war experience itself, kind of push enough people in the direction of a stronger national government that they have this constitutional convention. And James Madison, in particular, writes the U.S. Constitution as we know it today. Hopefully you have some familiarity with the U.S. Constitution, but if you don't, the big change, of course, from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution is that you have a much stronger national government with this division of powers, the separation of powers at the national level, at the federal government level. This was a way of ensuring, this is the idea of ensuring that this new national government wouldn't have too much power. It wouldn't be like creating a new British Empire, for example, but instead the national government would be weakened intentionally by being divided. So you'd have an executive branch led by the president. You'd have a legislative branch led, by Congress, of course, and the legislative branch would have the authority to write new laws that would then be enforced by the executive branch. And then, of course, the third branch is the judicial branch, with the Supreme Court of the United States at the top, deciding whether or not these laws were in keeping with the Constitution. So there were all these checks on power, on authority, in this new divided government at the top that were put in place to make sure people were comfortable with a stronger national government in the first place. So the Constitution, on the one hand, makes a stronger national government, and on the other hand, at the same time, weakens that government by dividing up its powers in this way. Your textbook talks, plenty of length about the constitutional debates, why there's basically a split between people who support the new Constitution and people who want to keep the Articles of Confederation. Initially, it seems that the new Constitution will not be ratified. Rhode Island, as I said, rejects it, and most other states, it seems like the majority is in favor of rejecting it. But you have the Federalist Papers, these famous papers, articles being written by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison in particular, that convince enough people that the Constitution does offer protections for liberty. It does provide for a more effective form of government than the Articles of Confederation. And enough political compromises are made that the votes start to change and the Constitution is eventually ratified. Rhode Island, for example, initially will vote it down, but then there'll be a popular referendum to ratify it later on. So study that carefully. Make sure you understand that shift, why we move from the Articles of Confederation, essentially the first Constitution, to the U.S. Constitution that we have today in 1787. What causes that shift? Why do enough people support that change to make it a reality? And then understand the Constitution at least a little bit. Understand the separation of powers. Understand the three branches of government. Understand the federal system of government that creates a national government, which today confusingly we call the federal government, and federalism divides power between the national government and the state governments. And the state governments retain a lot of power and a lot of responsibility, and the national government gets some responsibility as well. Over time, as we'll see, the national government will gradually grow stronger and stronger, and the state governments, relatively speaking, will grow weaker over time. But state governments are still very important. The Constitution, too, was ratified because of the addition of the first 10 amendments. So before it's even ratified, there's this promise that there'll be changes made to it. And those changes take the form of 10 amendments to the Constitution, which we now call the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights simply lays out in writing these promises that these specific individual liberties, these civil liberties, will be protected. The right of free speech, the right to a speedy trial, all these sorts of things that are enshrined in the Bill of Rights, basically have to be promised before enough people will vote to ratify the Constitution. So these are really the main things. And then the early fights in the 1790s during George Washington's administration are interesting because they kind of set the battle lines and they divide up these Revolutionary era compatriots into these groups of Federalist and Anti-Federalist, or Federalist and Jeffersonians, and they're not quite political parties yet, but they'll attack each other much the same way that Democrats and Republicans attack each other today. In fact, far more viciously in the 1790s than today even. So read that, Chapter 9 carefully if you haven't already, and make sure you understand these key developments in this very early period, because then we're going to jump ahead after the midterm quite a bit, by quite a few decades, and talk about Jacksonian America in the 1830s. But I wanted to make sure we at least covered this revolutionary period, the formation of a new nation with the new Constitution, and what that early new nation looked like, at least politically, before we jump ahead then and get into the mid-19th century and the problems that are sort of left over from the failures of the Constitution. Really quickly, the Constitution, of course, doesn't allow for the end of slavery. In fact, protects slavery and protects the interest of slave owners in the South. In fact, gives them more power than they had under the Articles of Confederation because of the 3/5 clause, which allows slave owners to count slaves proportionally, at least towards their representation in Congress, but doesn't, of course, give those slaves a vote. Doesn't even recognize them as people. It contains a fugitive slave clause, which means that even free states in the North have to return slaves to slave-holding territories in the South. And it allows for the continuation of the slave trade through 1808. And this is pretty crucial because slavery in the South had not been, it's big, but not as big as it will become, because in that period, in the 1790s and early 1800s, millions more slaves are going to be imported from Africa into the South because of this continuation of the slave trade. And it'll really pick up pace because of that 1808 deadline. People will be importing slaves at great numbers leading up to that date. So that failure to deal with slavery in any meaningful way will come back to haunt Americans, of course, in the Civil War. The Constitution doesn't protect the rights of women either, or Native Americans very well. And these are some issues that will come back to essentially haunt the Founding Fathers as well. Your textbook mentions Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, who tries to convince her husband but is unsuccessful, and tries to convince him that the Constitution should protect the rights and grant full rights to women as well as to men. But as John Adams replies, the men, including himself, aren't going to do that. They don't want to give up their privileges, even though it might be fair to do so. They're not going to. And so there are certainly some failings. And we'll talk about that in the coming weeks as we get into the 19th century and the 20th century too.